Shenmue, a game of discovery and adventure, a timeless classic, but one with a rather interesting history. A history which gains a new page starting today. Now at this point, most Shenmue fans are well aware of an unfinished version of the game on Sega Saturn. AM2 worked on this prototype prior to making the jump to Sega's Dreamcast. In the end, it was the right choice for the game and the system, and Shenmue became one of the Dreamcast's most beloved titles. But the history of its development and the knowledge of the Sega Saturn version is important in defining the history of the series. The Shenmue community is richer for it. Almost 19 years later then, Shenmue was given a second shot with the release of Shenmue 1 and 2 HD on modern platforms. This is a project Shenmue fans the world over had anticipated for years, and it finally happened, albeit with some flaws. But what if I told you that this was not the original version intended for release? What if there's another Saturn Shenmue moment out there, so to speak, just waiting to be discovered? This is Shenmue, the remastered version, and it's just a taste of what was in store for fans prior to 2018. And if you couldn't tell, this is not the version of Shenmue 1 and 2 HD that we received. It is instead a cancelled, unfinished version of the game. So where the heck did this come from? Well, the details are rather murky, but as we understand it, this remaster was in development for quite some time before the plug was pulled, likely due to budget constraints or perhaps concerns with changes being made to the core assets. The decision was made either way to scrap this version and instead focus on rebuilding the games for release on consoles using the original assets instead. While we don't know the full details here, this version of Shenmue was cancelled sometime in late 2017 and the team responsible for it went on to create the HD version that was released, suggesting that time constraints were significant during this project. Theoretically, this may help explain the inclusion of various bugs and glitches in the release version. The scope of the project simply changed. So, we have a rough idea of what happened, and we can't possibly presume to understand the business reasons behind it, but we're glad that its existence is no longer a mystery. This is an important work that should be preserved for the betterment of series history, even if it's just in the form of a video right now. But how does it compare? It doesn't really look like a brand new 2018 game after all, right? So what is it? Let's walk through some of the key areas featured in this video using the released HD collection as a comparison point to try and appreciate the differences. Keep in mind that this is very much incomplete and was still in development. So, let's begin here, just outside the gate to Ryo's home. The cancelled version suggests significant improvements to the rendering engine. Proper shadow maps are now visible. Textures and foliage are much higher resolution, while geometry complexity is increased. If we look closer at the gate, you'll notice ambient occlusion and additional geometry here as well. The roof tiles are fully modeled in the cancelled version, same goes for the fence posts. These are very flat in the Dreamcast original. The overall look is rather similar, but detail is increased across the board. Moving inside the Hazuki compound, the overhaul in foliage is immediately evident once again, while we see things like detailed stonework here along the edges, improved structures, and a better looking tree model. Real-time shadows are also once again evident here. In my opinion, this is one of the nicest looking areas in this unreleased version of the game. The atmosphere is similar enough to the original Dreamcast release, but there's just a lot of added detail and granularity and everything. This is definitely the kind of thing I would want to see in a remastered version of Shenmue. Let's go back outside then. This shrine here in Yamanose exhibits one of the larger upgrades in the demo. It's just flat out much more detailed all around. Texture and geometry detail is pushed up significantly, and the new lighting and shadows lend the scene a nice new look. Though I should say, when you look at scenes like this, some of the changes to lighting do kind of have a significant impact on the overall atmosphere. Perhaps a cool feature would have been the option to toggle between the new and old graphics, similar to something like the Halo Master Chief Collection. It would certainly have been an ambitious feature to include, but I think it would be well worth doing. So the areas around Ryo's house are quite detailed indeed, but what about the town itself? Well, I couldn't get a good comparison angle here, but you can see the addition of light shafts in the scene, and also hugely improved texture work on the sign. It's kind of a shame that the light shafts here didn't make it into the release version of the game. This also highlights a debug feature in action here, the placeholder ring around the character's head. Speaking of characters, the next shot suggests increased geometry on NPCs, along with new normal map textures designed to increase the perception of detail. Comparing this with the original then, there's still a boost in detail evident here, but it does feel less significant overall in this specific area. There's definitely additional work that could have been done here. The textures though are certainly much sharper, and again the shadows. And that's pretty much the entirety of the Shenmue 1 footage in this video. While the lighting and tone are certainly different than the original game, I do feel that this is an upgrade overall and would have been a fantastic way to re-release the game. Especially if the option to switch back to the original visuals had been available as well. But of course, thus far, this video is primarily focused on the original Shenmue. But that doesn't mean work wasn't also carried out on its sequel. Welcome back to Hong Kong, and the unreleased version of Shenmue II. This is a very different situation compared to Shenmue 1. The sequel was packed with large tall buildings and lots of wide open flat surfaces. Compared to the granular level of detail on display in the original Shenmue, Shenmue 2 instead chooses to focus on scale. Thus, first impressions suggest that the version being worked on here doesn't impress to the same degree as the original Shenmue. But if you look closely, you'll see that there have been plenty of changes nonetheless. Once again, texture detail is ramped up significantly here, and the addition of shadow maps adds depth to the environment. It's becoming a bit routine at this point, but you get the idea. The next shot, though, showcases some additional reflectivity on the glass windows here. This effect was not really possible in the original game on a Dreamcast, but it looks great, and even if the overall scene detail isn't massively ramped up, it's a really nice touch. If we dip inside the Golden Shopping Mall then, I observed an increase in geometry and texture detail once again. Notice the more rounded arches here in the distance, not to mention the higher resolution sign texture. The monitor here for Excite QTE 2 appears weirdly glitchy in this build, but the rest of the room is rather interesting. You can see evidence of more modern rendering techniques throughout the scene, but I'm not necessarily certain that it looks better than the original version. This is definitely a room where I prefer the original version. Then there's Manmo Temple, which benefits from the greatly increased geometry, texture detail, and shadows once again. Next up is this area beneath the tree, which seems to be performing quite poorly in this build, but again, it's unfinished software. If we compare with the original, there is more detail present, including leaves on the ground rather than just a simple texture. Ambient occlusion is also quite evident. But that's pretty much the bulk of what we have here. It's just a tiny taste of what was possible compared to the original release. So, what do you guys think? It's an interesting take on Shenmue, isn't it? Now, it's worth keeping in mind that this type of thing isn't uncommon in the industry. Developers regularly prototype ideas and projects all the time, and many of those projects never get made. It's really difficult to say for sure what happened here. It certainly could have been a budgetary issue. Sega may have realized at some point that, hey, it would cost too much to finish the project at the rate that the team is going, so let's just go for the original style instead. Or perhaps, seeing as this was developed in the West, maybe the original Japanese team wasn't entirely happy with the changes being made. That's also absolutely possible. Either way, it is a tad disappointing that we never got to play it, as it would have been a neat way to revisit the games, but at least we can see it here. What I'm more curious about here though is how the rendering has changed from the back end between this build and the final release that we got in August. The version of Shenmue 1 and 2 that we received does look very much like the original games, without bringing any significant visual changes to the table. There's bloom lighting, of course, which is nice, but would it have been possible to push the game even further, I wonder? Things like shadow maps and light shafts that are featured prominently in this video, for instance, would have been a great addition even with the original assets, but it's not entirely clear if this would have even been possible. We don't know how much of the original code is running in the background here, and we certainly don't know how much work done for this portion of the project has carried over to the final release. Then there's the matter of development time. I'd imagine the team learned a lot about the game's source code while working on the project at this point in time, and that knowledge was likely invaluable in building the final release. Even still, it does seem like the development cycle for Shenmue 1 and 2 was relatively short. Seeing that the game exists in this form, however, gives us a little insight into what was happening behind the scenes, and it's easy to understand how certain issues may have slipped through. It certainly must have been a challenging project to work on. I'm just glad to see that it exists at all. We may not have received this version of Shenmue, but you can tell that a lot of love and care went into the project. So that's basically where we're at with this. In the end, we ended up with Shenmue 1 and 2. Now, I had a really good experience with it overall and have since finished the games, but it's clear now that there were plenty of bugs present in certain areas of the games if you looked hard enough. Things like the darts not working properly in Shenmue 2, some of the music sounding incorrect, and a lack of analog control in some of the arcade games. The good news is that a lot of these major issues have been corrected with the current version of the game, but it's not clear if the remaining flaws will ever be touched upon. Still, knowing what we know now, I think it's pretty clear that this was a very challenging project for the team, and I do think it's somewhat understandable why the final release has some of these issues. But that's all for the moment. Perhaps in time we'll see more of this version of Shenmue. It's a key piece of series history, and it deserves to be preserved. So we'll just have to wait and see. Now, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give us a like, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, and follow us over on Twitter. Until next time.